The Pierian Mountains hold the last light longer than the land below them. At dusk, when the valleys of northern Greece have already settled into their blue-gray shadow, the ridgeline of the Pierian Range remains faintly luminous against the sky, a pale, clear outline running north to south along the border where Macedonia meets the edge of Thrace, catching the end of the day in a way that makes the mountains seem not quite finished with the sun yet, still in quiet conversation with it, while the rest of the world below has already let go. The air at that hour in that country has a particular quality. It cools rapidly as the light falls, carrying down from the ridge a stillness that is not the stillness of absence, but of attention, the feeling the ancient Greeks held of a landscape that is inhabited by something that does not announce itself and does not need to. The Greeks called this range home to the Muses, not metaphorically, not as a poetic shorthand for artistic inspiration, but as a genuine geographical belief. The 9 daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, the tightness of memory, were understood to live in the high country of Pieria, specifically in the region around the spring of Pieria and the slopes that bore their name, and the sound that sometimes came down from the mountains at dusk was understood as the sound of their activity, their presence in the stone and the air and the cold water of the springs that ran from the high ground down through the foothills. The region occupied the border between the Greek world as the southerners knew it and the wilder northern territory they called Thrace, a vast, uncertain land stretching east through what is now Bulgaria and into the edges of modern Turkey, a country the Greeks regarded with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, understanding it as a place where something old was still close to the surface, where the boundary between the human world and whatever lay beyond it was maintained less carefully than it was in the ordered South. It is from this border country, this threshold land between the familiar and the strange, that Orpheus comes. His name appears early in the surviving record of Greek poetry, which is itself a significant thing, since the surviving record has lost so much and kept so little that what has been preserved tends to have been preserved for a reason. The lyric poet Pindar, working in the first half of the 5th century before the Common Era, is among the earliest voices to speak of Orpheus explicitly and by name. Pindar was a Boeotian, writing odes commissioned for victors at the great Panhellenic Games, and his 4th Pierian ode, composed in celebration of a chariot victory at Delphi, takes a long, expansive route through myth before arriving at its subject, devoting a substantial portion of its length to the story of the Argonauts, the crew of heroes who sailed with Jason in search of the Golden Fleece. Among the names Pindar lists as members of that crew is Orpheus, who he calls, in the phrase the ancient Greek preserves with complete clarity, the father of songs. The phrase carried more than honorific weight. It named Orpheus not as a great musician, but as an origin, the figure from whom the entire tradition of lyric art descended, the source rather than one among many tributaries of the same river. What it meant to sail with the Argonauts was, in the Greek heroic imagination, to occupy the highest possible rank of human achievement. The crew of the Argo included Heracles, who was already the most celebrated hero the tradition had produced. It included Castor and Pollux, the divine twins, sons of Zeus. It included Pallas, whose son would be Achilles. To name Orpheus among these figures, as Pindar does without elaboration or apology, as though the placement requires no justification, was to establish him as belonging to the same stratum of the heroic world, a man whose gift was as significant to the expedition as any warrior's strength. The tradition held that on the Argo it was Orpheus who kept time for the rowers. his lyre setting the rhythm for the oarsmen so that the ship moved with a coordination it could not otherwise have maintained. The music doing, in practical terms, the work that a drum does in a military march, aligning many bodies into a single motion through the organizing force of sound. Imagine the scene as the oldest sources imply it. A ship in open water at dawn, the Aegean still and flat in the early light, the sky barely separated from the sea at the horizon, the rowers moving in their long, matched rhythm, while from the prow comes the sound of a lyre, carried back over the heads of the oarsmen by the same morning air that carries the smell of salt water and the sound of the hull's passage through the still surface. The music organizing the labor, the ship moving as though it were a single creature, rather than many men working in proximity. It is a practical image as much as a poetic one, the genuine function of music and the coordination of physical effort, which the Greeks understood clearly, and which Orpheus, in the tradition's telling, performed as well as any man who had ever lived. The name his tradition gives him fits the border country he comes from. His mother, in the most widely preserved ancient account, was Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, the eldest and most honored of the 9 sisters, the one whose domain was the grandest and oldest form of verbal art. The long narrative poem that carried a culture's knowledge of its heroes, its gods, and itself from one generation to the next. His father, in the same tradition, was Oeagrus, a mortal king of Thrace, which meant that Orpheus inherited from one parent the capacity for divine inspiration, the connection to the source of creative power in the Greek understanding of how such things worked, and from the other parent the weight of a mortal body, a human life, and all the conditions that came with existing in time. He stood at the crossing point of 2 kinds of being. His art came from one world, his life was conducted in another. This is not a coincidence in the Greek mythological imagination, it is an explanation, the tradition's account of how a man could do what Orpheus did with sound, why his music operated on a different register from any other musician's. What inheritance made him the father of songs, rather than simply a very good player of one? The lyre itself came from Apollo. This detail, the tradition states clearly and repeats across multiple sources without significant variation, which within the variable world of Greek mythology is a meaningful consistency. The things that hold their shape across different tellings and different centuries are the things the tradition had decided to keep. Apollo was among his many domains, the god of music and of prophetic knowledge, the deity whose oracle at Delphi was the most consulted source of divine guidance in the Greek world, the figure whose relationship to order and radiance and the organized formal beauty of the arts placed him at the opposite pole from his half-brother Dionysus, who governed the ecstatic and the uncontrolled. That this god, specifically, gave Orpheus his instrument was not a neutral fact. It meant that the music Orpheus played was rooted in the Apolline, in the structured, the harmonious, the art that organized rather than dissolved, that produced clarity rather than transport, even when the transport it produced in its listeners was real and overwhelming. And the effect of Orpheus's lyre on the world around him was, even within the expansive register of Greek myth, extraordinary. The tradition does not simply describe him as an unusually skilled performer, a musician whose playing moved human audiences to tears or joy, or both. It describes his music as operating on the physical world itself, on animate and inanimate things alike, on creatures that had no language for what they were hearing, and no cultural frame within which to understand it, and on objects that had no sensory apparatus at all. Animals gathered at his feet and stood in silence while he played. Trees, And this detail appears in multiple ancient sources with the same quality of matter-of-fact insistence. Trees uprooted themselves and moved toward the sound of his lyre. Stones shifted from their positions in riverbeds and on hillsides. Rivers, according to some accounts of the tradition, altered their course slightly to come closer to the music, drawn toward it the way everything else in the natural world was drawn. Following an impulse, the tradition does not explain mechanically because it does not need to. The music simply had this effect. It was a feature of the world as the tradition understood the world to work. There is a particular image worth resting inside for a moment. A stone at the edge of a river, dark, smoothed by water, lying in the mud where the bank slopes down to the current. It has been there for a long time. Its position is the position given to it by the river's work over years, the specific settling of its weight into the specific depression it has worn for itself in the soft ground. And then sometime in the night, it moves, not far, perhaps the width of a hand, perhaps less. But when the morning light comes down and touches the river bank, the stone is not where it was, and the side of it that was submerged is now dry, and the side that was dry is now slightly wet, and the small hollow it occupied for so long is empty. Something moved it. The tradition's answer is that a man was playing a lyre somewhere in the hills above the river, and the stone heard. What does it mean for a stone to hear music? The tradition is not offering a scientific claim. It is making a claim about the kind of order that Orpheus's music embodied, an order so fundamental, so close to the structure underlying the physical world, that even things without ears or minds could not fail to respond to it. The Pythagoreans, and whose school of thought flourished in the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, and who were deeply interested in the mathematical relationships underlying musical harmony, understood the cosmos itself as organized by the same numerical proportions that govern musical intervals. On this view, the physical world was already, in some sense, listening. It was already structured by the same ratios that gave music its form. For a musician whose art was as close to those underlying structures as Orpheus's was said to be, the boundary between affecting an audience and affecting the physical world would be less a barrier than a gradation, a matter of degree rather than kind. This is the world Orpheus inhabited before anything was required of him, a world in which his music was the most powerful force in the human sphere, in which the gods had given him his instrument and the divine lineage to use it fully, in which the natural world responded to what he played as attentively as any human listener. The hills of Thrace at night, fire burning at the center of a camp, and around the fire a closer ring of trees than there ought to be, trees whose roots have moved through the dark soil over hours, drawn toward the sound in the same silent way that everything was drawn toward it. The trees standing in their impossible ring, branches overhead blotting out the stars in a circle that didn't exist the previous night, while the man at the center of it all sits and plays and is aware, perhaps, of being surrounded by something that should not be there, something that his music has gathered without any intention of gathering it, simply by being what it was. Orpheus was, beyond all of this, a religious figure. The tradition that bore his name, Orphism, was not a casual attribution of mythological prestige to a teaching one wished to lend authority to, though that kind of attribution happened in the ancient world. It was a genuine religious movement with a documented history stretching back at least to the 6th century before the Common Era, and possibly earlier, with roots in the same Thracian and northern Greek territory from which Orpheus himself was said to come. The Orphic tradition concerned itself primarily with what happened to the soul after death, with the question of what the soul was, where it had come from, where it was going, and what, if anything, could be done to affect its trajectory. The Orphics held that the soul was immortal and divine in origin, but trapped in a cycle of reincarnation, bound to be reborn repeatedly into new bodies, human and animal both, until it had been sufficiently purified to be released from the cycle entirely and return to a state of divine freedom. They called this cycle of rebirth the Great Circle, and they held that Orpheus had been the first to describe it clearly, to map the soul's condition and its available paths with the authority of someone who had access to knowledge that ordinary mortals did not. The evidence for this tradition survives in a remarkable form. In tombs across the Greek world, in southern Italy, in Thrace itself, in Crete, and other parts of the Mediterranean, archaeologists over the past 2 centuries have found thin sheets of gold inscribed with small, carefully written letters, buried with the dead. These gold tablets, as they have come to be known, contain instructions for the soul after death, directions for how to navigate the geography of the underworld, which paths to take, which to avoid, what to say to the guardians one would encounter, what to drink and what to refuse to drink. The dead were given maps, careful, specific maps written in the language of poetry, inscribed on gold thin enough to fold into a small package, and placed in the mouth or on the chest, or in the hands of the buried body, so that the soul would have access to them when it needed them. And the authority behind these instructions, the source to which they were attributed, was Orpheus. He had walked that country, he had learned its rules, he had come back and recorded what he found, so that others could follow the route he had traced. What the gold tablets suggest beyond their specific content is a community of people who took the Orphic tradition seriously enough to inscribe its instructions on precious metal and bury it with their dead, which is not a casual or cheap commitment. These were people who believed that what Orpheus knew about the geography of the soul after death was accurate and actionable, that the directions he had provided would work, that the dead would find, in the underworld they arrived at, exactly the landmarks the tablets described, that the words they were meant to speak at the fountain of memory would be the right words, recognized by whoever or whatever stood guard there, sufficient to grant the soul the path it needed rather than the one it would be assigned by default. There is something in this that goes beyond mythology in the way the word mythology is sometimes used, as a synonym for something believed naively by people who didn't know better. The Orphic texts represent a careful, sustained attempt to think through the conditions of the soul after death, to map an experience that no ordinary living person could verify, and to preserve the results of that thinking in a form precise enough to be useful. Whether or not the soul survives death, whether or not the underworld exists in the form the Orphics described, the intellectual and spiritual seriousness of the project is real and is there in the objects themselves, in the thin gold, in the small letters, in the burial beside someone whose family wanted to ensure that when they arrived somewhere they had never been, they would not arrive without directions. The Pyrenean Mountains are still there. The ridgeline still holds the last light, longer than the valleys below it, still catches the end of the day at dusk in that particular way that makes the mountains seem to be attending to something the rest of the landscape has already let go of. The springs of Pieria still run cold from the high ground down through the foothills toward the plain. The border between the Greek world and the wild northern country beyond it has changed its political form many times since the 5th century, before the Common Era, and will presumably change again. But the land itself is not so different. The same limestone, the same ridgelines, the same quality of light, at the end of a clear autumn day, when the sky above the mountains turns a deep cold blue, and the first stars appear at the zenith before the horizon has gone fully dark. The tradition that placed the muses on those mountains, that understood the quality of the air there as the air of a divinely inhabited landscape, was a genuine belief held by people who knew the landscape well and found in it something that seemed to them to require an explanation beyond the merely geological. The Greeks were attentive to place in a way that modern sensibility sometimes struggles to fully inhabit, attentive to the specific character of specific locations, to the way certain springs felt different from other springs, the way certain hilltops seemed to gather something that other hilltops did not, the way certain nights in certain valleys produced a quality of silence that was different from the silence of other nights in other valleys. They gave names to these qualities. They described them as the presence of beings who inhabited the place and gave it its particular character. This was not ignorance or superstition in their self-understanding. It was an attempt to describe something real about the way that landscape, at its most specific and particular, can feel inhabited by something that does not announce itself, but is nevertheless there. Orpheus was born into that world, or rather was understood by the tradition to have been born into it, placed there by the account the Greeks gave of where musicians of his magnitude came from, what the intersection of divine inspiration and mortal life produced when it was working at its most extreme. His mother was the eldest of the 9 sisters who made their home in the Pierian high country. His father was a mortal king of the wild northern land below those mountains, and the god of music and order and prophetic knowledge gave him the instrument through which the 2 inheritances could work together, the physical object in whose strings the divine capacity and the mortal skill could meet and produce something that the world around him could not ignore. He played at the prow of a great ship, keeping time. He played in the hills of Thrace, and the stones moved. He played in the camp at night, and the trees gathered around the fire in a ring that had not been there the night before. He played, and the river altered its course by a fraction, drawn toward the sound the way everything was drawn, the way nothing could help being drawn, because the music was close enough to the structure of the world itself that the world could not remain entirely indifferent to it. And Pindar, sitting in Boeotia in the first half of the 5th century, before the Common Era, working on the long mythological digression that occupied the middle section of his 4th Pythian ode, reached the point in the Argonaut narrative where the crew needed to be named, and wrote down among the names, among the heroes and the demigods and the sons of divine parents, the name of Orpheus, and added, as though it required no further explanation, as though it were the simplest and most accurate way to convey who this person was and what his presence on the ship meant, the phrase that has survived the loss of most of what surrounded it, Father of Songs. The phrase holds something that is worth sitting with for a moment. Father of Songs. Not the greatest of singers, not the first musician, not the most skilled player of the lyre, though the tradition held all of those things to be true as well. Father. The word implies an origin, a generative source, a figure from whom something descends and spreads into the world that would not exist without him. The whole tradition of lyric poetry in the Greek understanding, the entire practice of setting language to music, of using the organized sound of the lyre as a vehicle for the highest expression the human voice could reach, all of it, in the tradition's self-understanding, descended from this one figure standing at the prow of a ship in open water, keeping time for the oarsmen while the Aegean lay flat and bright around the hull, and the music carried out over the water in the early morning air. What it meant to inherit such a title, To be the person the tradition named at the source of an entire art form is something the phrase invites the mind to settle around without necessarily resolving. It is a title that names not an achievement, but a condition. One does not become the father of songs by winning a competition or composing a celebrated work. One is the father of songs because something in what one is, in what one carries from the intersection of divine inheritance and mortal life, makes everything that comes after traceable back to one's beginning. Pindar is describing an origin. He is naming the place where an entire tradition believes itself to have started, before the ship sailed on, before anything was asked of the music except that it keep time in open water, before the world had presented Orpheus with a problem that his lyre would need to solve in a place where the solutions available to living men had run out. That moment had not yet come. The mountains still held their light. The muses still moved through the high country of Pieria in whatever way muses move. The springs ran cold from the high ground. Somewhere on the hillsides of Thrace, a ring of trees stood slightly closer to a dying fire than trees ought to stand, their roots having traveled through the dark earth to be there, drawn by a music that had stopped now, but whose effect on the world had not fully concluded. And Pindar had written the words, Father of Songs. They were there in the Ode, in the 5th century before the Common Era, and they have been there since, whatever else the years took, the words sitting in that old text, patient and unhurried, waiting for whoever comes next to read them and wonder what it meant. Along the Thracian riverbank, in the long heat of summer, the water moved slowly. The current did not rush. It pressed through bends in the land, with the particular patience of rivers that have been moving in the same direction for longer than any name given to them, carrying whatever the season had loosened from the banks above, a seed casing, a fallen stem, the faint impression of a cool shadow sliding across the surface where the light broke through the canopy of alder trees growing close to the water's edge. The grass along the bank stood tall enough in summer to conceal the ground between the stems. It was the kind of grass that made a sound in moving air, a low, continuous murmur that was almost like water itself, so that standing at the edge of the river in the warmest part of a summer afternoon, a person could lose the boundary between what was moving and what was still. The soil near the water held moisture through the driest months. It was soft underfoot, and it kept the shape of whatever had walked across it, the narrow prints of wading birds, the long dragging mark of a reed disturbed in passing, and sometimes, if the light was right and the observer attentive, the brief impression of a foot that had moved quickly, here and then gone. Virgil, writing in the 1st century BCE, placed Eurydice in exactly this kind of landscape. In the Georgics, his long poem about the natural world and its cultivation, she appears first not alone, but among a company of nymphs, moving together through a pastoral setting, a landscape of rivers and grass and slow warm air. She is one of several figures, not set apart from them in any obvious way, simply present in the same space, and the image Virgil gives is less a portrait than a suggestion of movement. Women in a summer meadow by water, walking together through tall grass, one of them slightly ahead of the others, and moving without hesitation toward the river's edge. It is an image that does not foreground any individual face or gesture. It is an image of belonging to a place, to a season, to a company of similar beings, to the particular quality of a Thracian summer afternoon. Her name was Eurydice. The tradition places her in this landscape as though she grew from it naturally, the way the alder trees grew along the bank, the way the grass grew thick and close-rooted in the damp soil near the water. She was, according to the ancient sources, a nymph, though the specific kind of nymph the tradition assigns her varies across the different accounts. Some ancient writers described her as a naiad, one of the freshwater nymphs associated with rivers and springs and streams, beings understood in ancient Greek tradition as the animating presences within specific bodies of water. A naiad belonged to a particular river or spring, was understood to be connected to it in something like the way a soul was connected to a body. The river thriving when the naiad thrived, the spring going cold or dry if the naiad who inhabited it was harmed or driven away. Other ancient accounts described Eurydice instead as a dryad, a nymph of trees and forests, whose life was bound not to flowing water, but to the roots and bark and living wood of the natural world above the ground. The difference between these two traditions is not trivial, though both place her firmly in the same general territory, the wild, living, unhuman landscape of the natural world, rather than the civic or domestic world of human settlements. Whether she belonged to the water or to the trees, she was a creature of places where the human world receded and the older world persisted beneath it. The variation itself is worth pausing on because it is characteristic of how the ancient Greek mythological tradition actually functioned. Mythology was not a single fixed text maintained by a central authority. It was a living body of stories transmitted across centuries through multiple poets, priests, local cults, and regional traditions, each of which carried its own version of figures, like Eurydice. What one source described as one thing, another described differently, and neither version canceled the other out. Both persisted, both were told, both were believed in their own contexts. What they shared was more significant than what they differed on. Eurydice was consistently of the natural world. She was consistently associated with the landscape of Thrace, with its rivers and its wild ground, with the quality of life that belonged to places at the edge of the human. Whatever she was specifically, water nymph, or tree spirit, or some version of both, that the ancient tradition held loosely without requiring precision, she was a being for whom the riverbank was home, the tall summer grass a natural environment, the sound of water a constant backdrop to her existence. The company she moved with in Virgil's image suggests something of what that existence was like. Nymphs in ancient Greek tradition were social beings, understood to move and gather in groups, to inhabit the same kinds of landscapes together, to share the slow rhythms of a world governed by season and water and growth, rather than by human time. They danced. They kept company with the Muses, with Artemis the huntress, with the various divinities of the natural world, whose jurisdiction was rivers and forests and mountains. Their lives, as the ancient tradition describes them, were long and bound to the places they inhabited, and they were understood as partly divine and partly not, more durable than humans, with a closer relationship to the divine world, but not fully gods, not immortal in the way the Olympians were immortal. They could be harmed, they could be lost. The ancient tradition acknowledged this plainly, without alarm, as part of the nature of things in a world that contained many kinds of beings with many kinds of lives, each with its own span and its own set of vulnerabilities. Eurydice's vulnerability, in the most widely told version of her story, was the ground itself. More precisely, it was what lay hidden in the ground, in the roots of the tall grass along a riverbank in Thrace, in summer, in the warm soil beneath the stems, where the light did not reach and the temperature stayed cool, even in the longest heat of the year. A serpent, resting in exactly that kind of place, would be invisible from above. The density of the grass made a kind of canopy over the ground level, and anything moving at speed through the stems, anything running, anything fleeing, anything too frightened or too purposeful to watch the ground carefully, would not see what was resting motionless in the roots below. In the version of the myth that Virgil tells in the Georgics, there was a reason Eurydice was running. The Georgics incorporate a figure not present in all accounts of the myth, a minor deity named Eurystheus, whose domain was beekeeping and agriculture, the cultivation of small, practical, essential things. He appears in Virgil's telling as a man who wanted Eurydice, who pursued her with that want, and whose pursuit is given as the direct cause of what happened. The scene Virgil constructs is a summer meadow by a river, the same kind of landscape already described. The same tall grass and slow water and warm air, and in that landscape Eurystheus was present, and Eurydice was not alone, and whatever the specific sequence of moments that preceded the running, the result was that she ran through the tall grass along the river bank, away from pursuit, moving fast enough that the ground beneath the stems was invisible to her, the soil soft and concealing, the distance between the grass roots and her feet collapsing with each step until one step landed where a serpent lay at rest in exactly the place she could not have known to look. The serpent is described in the ancient accounts with a kind of factual plainness that is itself part of the myth's register. It was not a monster. It was not a supernatural being sent specifically to cause this harm. It was a serpent in the grass by a riverbank in summer, entirely ordinary, entirely part of the landscape it inhabited, resting in the cool soil beneath the stems, because that was the kind of place such creatures rested in the heat of the day. Its stillness was not threat, but simply nature. A serpent at rest in tall grass on a summer riverbank was part of the world in the same way the grass was part of the world, the river part of the world, the nymphs moving through the meadow part of the world. The harm it caused was not malice, it was proximity. A foot landing too close to a creature that had no choice but to respond to the sudden disturbance. The venom worked quickly. This is all the ancient sources say about the physical experience of what happened. They do not dwell in it. Virgil and Ovid both treat the moment with a kind of clean brevity that is its own form of respect, not because the death was unimportant, but because the tradition understood certain events as belonging to the category of things that are simply true, simply part of what happens, and that do not require extended description to be felt. A bite. Venom that moved quickly through a body built for a different kind of living than human bodies, a body more closely attuned to the natural world it belonged to, and therefore more quickly undone by what that world contained. The grass would have continued to move in whatever breeze was moving across the meadow. The river would have continued past. The afternoon would have continued toward evening, the light shifting in the incremental way of long summer days, the shadows lengthening gradually across the field. What the ancient sources agree on is the speed of the transition between the living world and the dead one. In the understanding of ancient Greek tradition lay a boundary that the soul crossed in a moment, and whatever characterized the living world of a naiad or a dryad, whatever it meant to be a being of rivers and grass and the warm seasons of the year, that ended with a completeness that left no residue in the field above the ground. The meadow afterward would have looked exactly as it did before. The grass returned to its resting position. The river continued its particular indifference, which was not cruelty, but simply the quality of things that have their own direction and do not alter it for the events of a single afternoon. Eurydice, who had been among her company of nymphs moving through the summer landscape, was not there anymore. The version of events without Eurydice is older, and in that telling, she died simply as a consequence of the afternoon she was having, walking through tall grass in summer near a river, the kind of afternoon nymphs had in the Thracian tradition, with no particular cause for alarm and no particular reason to be watchful of the ground. In that version, the death is not the result of being pursued. It is not the consequence of anyone's desire. It is something that happened on an ordinary afternoon to a being who was doing what she normally did in the landscape she normally inhabited, and the randomness of it is part of what gives that version a different quality. Not the shape of a tragedy in which error compounds error and causes accumulate, but something more like the shape of life itself in the ancient understanding, in which the capacity for harm exists in every ordinary afternoon, distributed through the world without particular intention. Ancient sources give Eurydice very little independent characterization beyond these facts of her nature and her death. She is consistently described as the wife of Orpheus, which itself establishes one frame. The most widely told version of the myth places her death on or very close to her wedding day, or shortly after her marriage, when whatever the future of that union was meant to be had not yet had time to unfold. The wedding is significant because it marks the moment at which her life and Orpheus's life were formally joined, the moment at which her story was meant to begin its next shape, and the myth intervenes at exactly that point with the serpent in the grass and the venom that worked quickly. She arrived at the threshold of one life and crossed instead into a completely different destination. Hades, the Greek name both for the god who ruled the underworld and for the place itself, was not where she had been headed on that afternoon. What the ancient tradition chose to preserve about Eurydice, sparse as it is nevertheless specific in its own way. She was of the natural world. She moved with others. She was associated with the particular quality of the Thracian landscape, its rivers, its meadows, its wild ground at the edge of the territories that human civilization had settled. She died quickly, on an afternoon in summer, and passed into the underworld before her marriage could truly become a life shared with Orpheus in the ordinary sense of that phrase. In the tradition that Virgil and Ovid and others transmitted, she became the emotional engine for what Orpheus did next, the cause of a grief so complete that it could not be absorbed by any of the human or natural world's normal methods of acceptance, and that instead turned outward and downward toward the impossible. It is worth understanding what the ancient Greek tradition meant by impossible in this context. The boundary between the living and the dead was, in ancient Greek understanding, one of the most absolute boundaries in the structure of existence. It was not simply a physical divide, though the geography of the underworld, with its rivers and its guardians and its various territories, was described in very physical terms. It was a boundary of category. The living and the dead belonged to different orders of existence, governed by different rules, sustained by different things, moving toward different destinations. The dead did not return. This was not a belief that allowed for exceptions. The entire structure of ritual practice around death in ancient Greek tradition, the careful preparation of the body, the coin placed in the mouth for the ferryman, the mourning that followed specific patterns and lasted specific lengths of time, was built on the understanding that the dead had gone to a place that the living could not follow them into and return from. To attempt the journey was not simply dangerous, it was a category violation, a crossing of the kind of line the ancient world understood as definitional, as part of what made the world the shape it was. And yet the tradition held that Orpheus attempted it, that the grief for Eurydice was of a scale that could not be accommodated within the category of things one accepted and survived and eventually moved through. The ancient sources are consistent on this point. He did not grieve in the ordinary way, did not accept the ordinary consolations, did not follow the ordinary path that the bereaved followed in the ancient world. Instead, he took his lyre and went toward the place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thinnest, the place the ancient world located, in specific geographical terms, at the southernmost point of the Greek mainland, where the limestone cliffs came down to the sea, and a cave in the rock was understood to descend into the underworld itself. Before all of that, though, there was the meadow, there was the afternoon, still continuing after she was gone, the light moving toward evening in its incremental way, the grass settling back into its resting position, the river moving past the place where something had happened, without slowing for it or marking it in any way the surface could show. Nymphs were understood in ancient tradition to inhabit places, to be almost inseparable from the specific rivers and trees and springs they belonged to, and when one was gone from such a place, the absence was both absolute and invisible. The landscape looked the same, functioned the same, continued the same, but something that had been present in it was not present anymore. The river did not stop. The grass did not change. The afternoon did not register what the afternoon had taken. This is what the ancient tradition chose to give Eurydice. In the end, a few sparse facts of her nature, an afternoon in summer, a landscape that did not mark her loss, and then by indirection, something more unusual. She became the reason a living man descended into the place of the dead. She became the reason a musician played for the ruler of the underworld. She became the reason the ancient tradition preserved the image of the Furies weeping, something they had not done before and would not do again. Whatever the ancient sources failed to give her in terms of independent characterization, they gave her instead the magnitude of what her absence caused, which was, in its own way, a form of presence, continuing through the myth long after the afternoon in the meadow had closed over her. The word the ancient Greeks used for what Orpheus did was katabasis. It is a Greek word built from two parts, kata, meaning down, and bainein, meaning to go or to step, a going down, a descent. The term was used in ancient tradition not only for Orpheus's journey, but for other figures in Greek mythology who descended into the underworld while still living. Heracles, who went down to bring Cerberus up from the realm of the dead. Odysseus, who traveled to the edge of the underworld to consult the dead prophet Tiresias. Aeneas in the Latin tradition, who descended to speak with his father. The word carried with it the understanding that such a journey moved against the natural direction of things. The dead descended into the underworld, and from there they did not go back up. A catabasis performed by the living was an inversion of the normal order, a movement that the world's own structure worked against. To name the act so plainly, with a single Greek word that simply meant going down, is characteristic of the way the ancient tradition held this story. There was nothing in the word katabasis that performed the weight of what it described. It was a word for a direction, made into a word for a specific and extraordinary kind of journey by the tradition that used it. And standing at the edge of what it described, knowing that the meadow was behind, the afternoon still continuing in its ordinary way, the river still moving, the word carried something of that quality of plainness, of naming a thing that was about to happen without needing to raise the register of the air around it. Katabasis, a going down, into the place that the ancient world had mapped with considerable precision, its rivers and its guardians and its plains where the majority of the dead simply continued, without great suffering or great joy, in the flat light of an afterlife that asked nothing further of them, into the place from which the tradition had always held no living person returned by the route they had taken going down, a descent. The word settled quietly over the myth's next shape, the way water settled into the impressions left in the soft soil of a Thracian riverbank, filling the spaces between what had been and what would follow, holding the shape of both without urgency, simply present, simply the Greek word for going down. The afternoon in the meadow was over. The grass had returned to its ordinary position. The river moved on, and somewhere in the Thracian hills, where trees were known to uproot themselves and follow certain music, where stones shifted in the night to be closer to a sound they could not account for by any other law, somewhere in that landscape of wild ground and old spiritual tradition, Orpheus understood what had happened and began to understand what he intended to do about it. The ancient sources do not dwell in that moment of understanding. They simply note its consequence. He took his lyre, he went toward the boundary, he began to descend. Everything that came before the descent, the afternoon, the grass, the serpent resting in the cool soil beneath the stems, the venom that worked quickly, the river continuing, all of it settled into the fixed past of the myth, where it would remain, unchanged and unchangeable, the world that the descent was moving away from. And the word for the descent itself was katabasis, the Greek word for going down, spoken quietly, like a door visible at the far end of a long corridor, approached without haste, its shape clear even from this distance, the space between here and there filled with the ordinary sound of a summer afternoon already behind us. At the southernmost point of the Greek mainland, where the Laconian peninsula tapers to its last thin wedge of rock and drops into the sea, there is a cape called Tenarum. The limestone cliffs there fall straight into the water, worn smooth by centuries of salt wind, and the sea below them moves in a particular way, neither rough nor quite still, but turning slowly against the rock in long, deliberate swells, as though it is thinking about something. The cape juts south into the Mediterranean, with the quality of a place that has been at the edge of things for a very long time. Fishermen in the ancient world would have known its profile from out at sea, that particular fall of the headland, the way the light caught the pale stone in the early morning, and they would have known what the land held there, inside the cliff, where a cave opened in the rock and descended into the dark beneath the earth. The ancient Greeks understood Tanarum as one of the places where the world of the living and the world of the dead came nearest to touching, not a metaphor for such a place, not an allegory, a specific physical location on a specific peninsula in the southern Peloponnese, marked on the landscape the way a spring or a temple was marked, where the ground itself was understood to open downward into another country. The cave at the cape was narrow at its entrance, requiring a person to duck through, and once inside, the light from the mouth of it fell away quickly, the way light falls away in limestone, not all at once but in stages, each step taking a little more of it, until the warmth of the outside air was gone and there was only the cool, even temperature of the rock. From somewhere beyond the cliff face, the sea could still be heard. That sound, the sea, muffled and persistent, audible from inside a darkness that had nothing to do with the sea, was perhaps one reason the ancient world found this particular cave convincing as a threshold. It was a place where two kinds of sound occupied the same space without fully reconciling. The ancient Greeks gave the underworld a name, Hades, the same name they gave to the god who ruled it, so that the place and its lord were in some sense the same word. The realm of Hades was not understood as a punishment for the dead in itself. It was simply where the dead went, all of them eventually, except those few whom the gods saw fit to translate directly into immortality or into the stars. The shades of the dead passed out of the upper world and traveled downward, guided in some accounts by Hermes, the god of transitions, the one deity who moved freely between the realms of the living and the dead, and they arrived at the rivers that marked the boundary of the country they were entering. The first and most important of those rivers was the Styx. The Styx wound through the underworld in ancient accounts as both a physical boundary and a sacred force. An oath sworn on the Styx was the most binding oath a god could make, so powerful that even Zeus could not violate it without consequence. The river was dark, not because of depth alone, but because of what it carried, which the Greeks understood as a kind of concentrated truth about the finality of death. No living being crossed it without the intervention of something extraordinary. The dead crossed it by paying their fare to Charon, the ferryman who had worked that passage since before any living generation could remember, his narrow boat moving back and forth across the dark water with the steady indifference of a man who has done the same work, so long that the work and the man have become one thing. The Charon appears in ancient vase paintings with a consistency that suggests the Greeks had a clear and agreed upon sense of what he looked like. He is lean, often unkempt, his clothing dark or plain, one hand extended for the payment he requires. The coin was everything. Without it, he would not move. The custom of placing a coin, typically an obol, a small denomination, the lowest practical unit of Greek currency, in the mouth of a corpse before burial, or on the eyes, was not a gesture of sentiment. It was a practical arrangement, made for the dead person's benefit, so that when they arrived at the water's edge, they would have what they needed to cross. A thin obol coin, resting against the cold eyelid of a buried body, its weight almost nothing, its significance absolute. The Greeks understood that the small coin was the price of passing from one state of existence into the next, and that without it, the dead were stranded. Those who arrived at the Styx without payment were not destroyed, they were simply left to wait. The tradition held that unburied or unpaid shades would spend 100 years on the near bank of the Styx, unable to cross, unable to return to the upper world, simply persisting at the edge of the water until time had run its course, and Charon would take them across without the coin. This was considered a genuine hardship, not a punishment in the full sense, which was reserved for the guilty, but a significant delay, an interruption of the soul's progress. It was one of the reasons the Greeks regarded proper burial as a serious obligation. To leave the dead unburied was not merely disrespectful, it was to strand them at a river in the dark for a century, unable to complete the crossing they needed to make. The Styx was one of 5 rivers in the ancient Greek underworld, each of them carrying a distinct function and character. The Acheron, the river of woe, was in some accounts the primary river of crossing, conflated with the Styx in certain sources, and treated as its own distinct body of water in others, its name carrying a weight that Greek speakers would have felt in the sound of it. The Lethe moved through the underworld with a quality entirely unlike the others. Its water, when drunk, erased memory. The tradition held that souls destined for reincarnation were brought to the Lethe before their return to the upper world, so that they would carry nothing of their previous existence into the next one, arriving in a new body and a new life, with no knowledge of what had come before, the way a clean vessel holds no trace of what it held previously. The Lethe ensured that the cycle of rebirth began fresh each time, that the weight of accumulated lives did not stack up into something a new soul could not carry. Memory, in this account, was the one thing the dead were systematically relieved of, except for the few who drank from the spring of Mnemosyne. Memory itself, personified as water, instead. The gold tablets found in graves in southern Italy and elsewhere, inscribed with instructions for the dead, told them to avoid the Lethe and seek the other water. Those tablets were practical documents. They assumed the dead would need directions. The Phlegetes ran through the underworld as a river of fire, and the name carries the sense of burning in its Greek root. Its banks were not the banks of ordinary water. The Phlegethon bordered the regions of punishment. Tartarus, the deep place beneath the underworld itself, where the guilty were held in conditions specifically shaped to address whatever wrong they had committed in life. The River of Fire was not merely decorative geography, it was the element appropriate to a country where the worst of what the living had done was being answered. The fifth river was the Cocytus, the river of lamentation, and it was understood as the place where the unburied wandered during their 100 years of waiting, its name drawn from the Greek word for wailing, for the sound that unfinished grief makes when it has nowhere to go. The five rivers together gave the underworld a kind of internal logic, each one marking a different aspect of death's meaning: the crossing, the woe, the forgetting, the punishment, the mourning that cannot yet conclude. The country was not simply dark, it was elaborately organized, its geography carrying the full weight of what the Greeks believed death involved. Crossing the Styx brought the shade to the gates of the underworld proper, and at those gates stood Cerberus. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century BCE, described him as a dog with 50 heads, a number that later tradition contracted to 3, 3 becoming the figure that settled into the imagination of the ancient world and stayed there. 3 heads, a serpent for a tail, and from his back grew additional snakes, their scales visible even in the dark of the gate where he kept his post. The ancient sources are consistent about his purpose. Cerberus was not there to prevent the dead from entering, but to prevent them from leaving, and equally to prevent the living from coming in. He was the guarantor of the underworld's most fundamental rule, which was that the boundary between the living and the dead moved in only one direction, downward, inward, toward the dark, and did not reverse. The dead did not return, the living did not enter. These were not preferences, but the structure of the world. The exceptions to that structure were few, and each of them is notable precisely because of how much effort the exception required. Heracles, in one of his 12 labors, was sent to bring Cerberus out of the underworld alive, which he accomplished through physical force, wrestling the dog into submission with his bare hands. The ancient world understood this as a demonstration of Heracles' impossible strength, the kind of strength that could briefly suspend a rule that nothing else could. Other heroes who descended to the underworld, Odysseus, Aeneas in Virgil's account, Theseus and Pirithous in a version that went badly, each did so through their own means, each negotiating the crossing in the particular way their story required. The underworld admitted exceptions, but it made each one costly. Beyond Cerberus, past the gate, the realm of Hades opened into a geography that the ancient Greeks described with some consistency across sources. There was a hall, large implied to be the largest place imaginable, though ancient sources rarely settled on its exact dimensions, where the dead gathered and where judgment was administered. Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Acus sat as judges in this hall, 3 former mortal kings who had lived with such justice and wisdom in life that Zeus appointed them to their posts after death, granting them the authority to determine the destination of every arriving soul. They had been kings of Crete and Agana in life. Minos, one of the sons of Zeus and Europa, whose name carried the weight of legend even before his death. Rhadamanthus, celebrated in the ancient world as a lawgiver of exceptional integrity. Eurydice, grandfather of Achilles, revered for his fairness. Their qualifications were not administrative, they were moral. The Greeks understood that the ability to judge the dead required the kind of character that had already demonstrated its quality in life. The judgment they administered sorted the arriving dead into one of 3 destinations. Tartarus lay at the bottom of everything beneath the underworld itself, the way the underworld lay beneath the earth. separated from the realm of Hades by a distance that Hesiod described as proportional to the distance between the earth and the sky. A bronze anvil dropped from the earth's surface would take 9 days to reach the underworld. Dropped from the underworld into Tartarus, it would take 9 more. Tartarus was the place of punishment for the genuinely guilty, those who had committed crimes against the gods or against the fundamental moral order that the gods enforced, and its punishments were typically fitted with an exactness to the crime that gave them a quality of metaphorical precision. Those who had overreached in life were punished by perpetual frustration. Those who had transgressed through violence received violence administered with similar permanence. The punishments were not temporary. They were the permanent condition of the guilty dead, which was perhaps why the ancient world found them interesting enough to name and describe in detail across so many sources. Among the most often described of those punishments were the ones imposed on figures whose crimes had been significant enough to name specifically. Tantalus, son of Zeus, invited to dine with the gods who had stolen their food and their secrets, and in the version most consistently preserved, served his own son as a meal at a divine banquet, stood in the underworld in water up to his chin, with branches laden with fruit hanging just above his reach. When he bent to drink, the water receded. When he reached for the fruit, the branches lifted away. The word tantalizing carries his name forward into modern languages. The sensation he was made to experience, permanently translated into a common word for a particular kind of frustration. Sisyphus, who had cheated death twice during his lifetime, most notably by trapping death itself in chains so that the living could not die, was made to roll an enormous boulder up a hill in Tartarus, only for the boulder to roll back each time it neared the top, requiring him to begin again and again without cessation. Ixion, who had murdered his own father-in-law and later attempted to assault Hera, the queen of the gods, was bound to a spinning wheel of fire that turned without stopping. The Danaids, the 50 daughters of Danas, 49 of whom had murdered their husbands on their wedding night, at their father's command, carried water in vessels perforated at the bottom, pouring it endlessly without being able to fill anything. These were the occupants of Tartarus, a place that existed but was not the whole of the underworld, not even the largest part of it. The majority of the dead, those who had lived ordinary lives without particular virtue or particular crime, did not go to Tartarus, and they did not go to the place of reward that waited for the virtuous, which the Greeks called Elysium, or the Elysian fields. They went to the asphodel meadows. Homer describes them in the Odyssey. Odysseus, traveling to the edges of the underworld to seek the shade of the prophet Tiresias, encounters the asphodel meadows as a wide, pale plain where the majority of the dead are simply present, simply continuing. The grass in those meadows is gray-white. The word asphodel describes a real flower, pale-petaled, common in the Mediterranean, planted at grave sites, and associated in the Greek imagination with the transition between the living world and the world of the dead. The meadows are not a punishment. The dead there are not in pain. They are simply there, wandering, persisting, occupying the vast plain that the underworld had set aside for those who needed somewhere to be. The light in that place is even and flat, described by those who encountered it as a kind of perpetual gray afternoon, without the quality of morning or evening to distinguish one moment from the next, time continuing, but without the rhythm that the living used to feel its passage. The shades of the asphodel meadows retain a kind of identity. They know who they were. They recognize one another, but they lack the vitality that would let them speak without assistance. When Odysseus wants to question the dead during his visit to the underworld's edge, he must first offer blood sacrifice, the blood restoring to the shades, temporarily, the capacity to speak clearly, to think with something like the sharpness they had in life. Without it, the dead move through the asphalt meadows with a dimness that is not quite the complete absence of the self, but is its shadow, the memory of a self still present in the form, but no longer animated by everything that made it feel specific. The shade of Achilles, whom Odysseus encounters and praises as a hero whose glory continues even in death, answers with a directness that Homer uses to make a point the whole scene has been building toward, that Achilles would rather be the poorest living man, working for a poor master in the upper world, than be the king of all the dead in the underworld. The living world, with its difficulty and its mortality and its particular quality of light, was worth more than the afterlife's perpetual gray afternoon. This was the place the majority of human souls occupied after death, and the ancient Greeks described it without evident alarm. The asphodel meadows were not a threat. They were a condition, and a quite neutral one, compared with what Tartarus offered or what Elysium required. The dead who inhabited them were neither punished nor particularly rewarded. They were simply there, in that wide, pale plain, for as long as the world continued, and the underworld held them. The meadows had the quality of something very patient, a vast space organized to accommodate an indefinitely large number of souls, without crowding them toward anything or requiring anything from them. The gray grass underfoot, and the flat light above, and the many figures simply moving through it all, not hurrying, not stopping. Elysium occupied the other end of the spectrum, the place set aside for those whose virtue or divine favor had marked them out from the common run of the dead. Heroes, those especially favored by the gods, those whose piety had been exemplary enough to merit distinction. These went to the Elysian fields, which ancient sources described with a warmth absent from the asphodel meadows. In some accounts, Elysium was a place of perpetual spring, its air mild, its light closer to the light of the upper world than to the gray of the meadows. In the Odyssey, Proteus tells Menelaus that because he is the son-in-law of Zeus through his marriage to Helen, he will not die in the ordinary way, but will be carried to Elysium instead, the furthest western shore, where the living is easiest for men. The distinction mattered not because the dead there were doing anything the dead of the asphodel meadows could not do, but because the quality of their continuing existence was different, warmer, lighter, more like the world they had come from. The Fortunate Isles, or Isles of the Blessed, appear in some accounts as a further distinction within Elysium, a place for those who had been judged worthy of Elysium in multiple lives, who had earned their way to that most privileged afterlife through more than one existence of demonstrated virtue. Pindar describes them in his second Olympian ode with a specificity that suggests genuine belief in their particularity, a place where the wind from the sea was gentle, where golden flowers burned in a light unlike any other, where the air had something in it that the asphodel meadows could not offer, and that Elysium itself only approached. These were the best places the dead could reach, and reaching them required the kind of record across multiple lives that only a very few could claim. What all these places shared, Tartarus, the asphodel meadows, Elysium, the Isles of the Blessed, was permanence within the long framework of the world's continuance. The dead who arrived at the underworld did not expect to leave again. The structure of the place was built on that assumption. Charon's coin secured the crossing, and the crossing was one way. Cerberus kept the gate. The judges assigned each soul to the place appropriate to its record, and the soul went there, and the world continued above. The rivers moved in their courses. The shades occupied their particular country. The punishments in Tartarus continued without interruption. The gray grass of the asphodel meadows spread out across its wide, quiet plain, and the many dead walked through it as they would continue to walk through it for a very long time. There was a logic to the whole arrangement, the kind of logic that is more like a landscape than an argument, not something you work out from first principles, but something you find yourself already inside, its geography clarifying as you move further into it. The ancient Greeks who built this world in their imaginations over centuries of telling and retelling did not build it to be frightening, they built it to be comprehensive. Every soul accounted for, every moral account eventually addressed, every boundary marked and kept by the appropriate guardian. The underworld was, in a particular sense, a complete world, one that had rules the living world did not always manage to enforce, where what happened above was eventually measured against a standard that did not change or negotiate or forget. The rivers went on moving. The ferry crossed the Styx when the dead arrived and needed passage. Cerberus lay at the gate, watchful, his three heads alert in their different directions, his serpent tail moving slowly in the dark. Minos and Rhadamanthus and Aeacus occupied their posts in the Hall of Judgment, hearing the accounts of arriving souls as they had heard them since Zeus appointed them, each soul given the attention it required, each verdict delivered according to the same fixed standard. The Furies, those ancient goddesses of vengeance who existed for the specific purpose of pursuing the guilty and ensuring that no wrong went unanswered, moved through the underworld as they always had, attending to the punishments they enforced, and watching with the kind of attention that did not waver, that had been doing what it did since before the present gods had settled into their functions. And in Tartarus, in the deep beneath the deep, the particular punishments continued with the precision that gave them their quality of metaphor, made physical. Sisyphus pressed his hands against the boulder on its hill. The familiar weight of it, the familiar resistance, the familiar brief plateau before the slope asserted itself again. The wheel of Ixion turned in the dark, its fire describing a slow, bright circle. The Danaids lifted their perforated vessels and poured, and the water ran through the holes and vanished, and the vessels needed to be filled again. Tantalus stood in his water with his unreachable fruit, the water receding from his mouth as it had always receded, the branches lifting as they always lifted, the same distance always maintained between what he needed and what he could reach. These were the dead in their country, occupying the places the judges had assigned them, doing what the structure of that country required. Above them, separated by the full depth of the earth, the distance a bronze anvil would fall for 9 days without stopping. The living world continued in its own arrangements, its own geography, its own particular quality of light. The cape at Taenarum stood in its sea wind above the cliffs, the cave in the rock opening downward into limestone dark. The sea moved against the stone below. The world of the dead was there, below the cave, below the stone, below the roots of the cliffs, organized in its complete and patient geography, river by river, plain by plain, all the way down to the fire of Phlegethon and the deep still country of Tartarus beyond it. The asphodel meadows at the center of all this, vast, pale, unhurried, held the greatest number of the dead in their quiet continuance. For shade among shade, the former living moved through the gray-white grass in the flat, even light, recognizing and recognized, not suffering, not joyful, simply there. The meadow spread in every direction, without a horizon that suggested an end to it. The grass the same everywhere underfoot, the light the same everywhere above, the many figures moving through it in the way that a tide moves through an estuary, without particular urgency, filling the available space, following no specific path, but covering the whole of the ground over time. Quiet, wide, very old, the place the Greeks believed most human souls would occupy, for as long as the world held them, the gray asphodel flowers at their feet, and the particular stillness of a country where nothing was being decided and nothing was yet finished. At the edge of the Styx, the air does not move. It has never moved. There is no wind in that place, no current of warmth or cold carried from one direction to another, only the perfect stillness of a world that has no weather, no season, no reason to change. The river surface is dark and flat and holds no reflection. The water does not catch light because there is no light to catch, only the particular dim quality of the underworld itself, which is not darkness, exactly, but the absence of the kind of brightness the living take for granted. The way the world looks when every lamp has been turned very low, and the eyes have adjusted as far as they can, and the shapes around them are still only shapes present, but not fully resolved. This is the air Orpheus stepped into when he descended. This is the stillness that surrounded him when he reached the far end of whatever passage he had walked to arrive here. And it was into this stillness, unhurried, without announcement, that he placed his fingers against the strings of his lyre and drew from them a single note. The note entered the air of the underworld the way a stone enters still water, creating a disturbance that moved outward in all directions from the point of its origin, touching surfaces that had not been touched in a very long time. Charon, the ferryman, had been standing in his shallow boat at the near bank of the Styx, as he had always stood, as he would always stand, one hand resting loosely on his pole, his face turned toward the line of the dead, who waited in their gray patience at the water's edge. He was lean and unkempt, that ancient figure, dressed in whatever it was that ferrymen of the dead wore, and he had been performing the same action since the beginning of the world, extending his hand for the coin, drawing the pole through dark water, delivering each soul to the far bank without comment, returning for the next one. The transaction had a specific rhythm. It did not deviate. Nothing in Charon's existence until that moment had required it to deviate. And then the note from Orpheus's lyre reached the place where he stood, and the rhythm stopped. Virgil, writing in the 1st century BCE, in his great poem on farming and the natural world, described what happened at the Styx as a kind of wonder, the ferryman standing motionless while the river itself marveled, the dark water registering the sound 7 times over as the note carried across its surface and returned. What Virgil preserved in that image is the specific quality of the underworld's response to Orpheus's music, which was not the response of something defeated or overpowered, but the response of something that simply could not continue what it had been doing. The boat rested on the water without moving. The line of waiting dead stood where they were. Charon's hand, which had been extended for the coin it always received, remained in the air without its coin, and the ferryman who had never in the history of the dead done anything other than ferry them across his river, simply waited, the way a person waits when they have heard something they do not yet understand, and their body has paused itself to give the understanding room to arrive. This was a living man crossing the Styx that had not happened before. The rule of the river was absolute. The dead came across it in one direction, and nothing that breathed came across it at all. The coin in the mouth of a properly buried corpse purchased passage. The unburied waited on the near bank for 100 years, until Charon would carry them without payment. These were the terms of the crossing. They had always been the terms. And yet across the dark water, in the boat that was not moving, through the air that had no weather in it, the sound of the lyre continued, note following note, the music opening up into something more than a single sound, becoming a kind of argument made entirely without words, and Charon, whose function was the border between the living and the dead, allowed the border to be crossed. What Orpheus played as he was ferried across the Styx, ancient sources do not record precisely, and there would be no purpose in inventing it. What matters is the quality the tradition consistently attributed to his music, which was not that it was beautiful in the ordinary sense, pleasant to hear, skillfully made, but that it reached something prior to judgment, prior to the capacity to evaluate or resist. Animals followed it because animals have no particular reason not to follow a sound that draws them. Trees shifted their roots in its direction because what the tradition said about trees was that they were simply closer to the ground than people and therefore more susceptible to what moved through it. Rivers altered their courses. Stones on riverbanks shifted a few inches and were found later wet on the side that had been facing away from the water. These were the effects attributed to Orpheus's playing in the living world, and what the tradition understood was that the underworld, being composed of everything the living world had produced, every soul that had ever lived, every creature that had ever died, contained within it the same susceptibility to his music, only amplified because the dead had nothing left to distract them from the pure fact of a sound. Cerberus was waiting at the gate. The ancient sources are consistent on the matter of Cerberus: 3 heads, a serpent for a tail, and along his back the growth of additional serpents rising from the skin between his shoulders, all of them alert in their separate way, all of them oriented toward the entrance. He was placed there to guard. Hesiod, in the 8th or 7th century BCE, gave the creature 50 heads in his theogony, before the tradition consolidated around 3, and the logic of either number is the same: a guardian that can watch every approach simultaneously, that is never fully turned away from any angle, that has no single point of attention that might be exploited by something trying to slip past unnoticed. His purpose was dual, and the ancient sources made this explicit. He was there to prevent the living from entering and to prevent the dead from leaving. He managed both with equal vigilance, which was why when Heracles came to the underworld to perform his last labor, the only way through was force, a contest between the hero's physical strength and the guardian's resolved by overpowering the 3-headed dog and dragging him briefly into the sunlight before returning him to his station. That was one way past. It was the way of a hero who had already performed 11 other labors requiring extraordinary violence and was not a musician. Orpheus was a musician. He played, and Cerberus lay down. The tradition does not describe the exact moment at which the guardian's posture changed, but the image is clear enough in its outlines: 3 heads that had been raised and alert, turning gradually lower, lowering further, until all 3 rested together on the broad forepaws, the eyes moving from watchful to half-closed, the serpents along the great back growing still, ears flat, body heavy, the gate behind him standing open in a way it had never stood open while a living figure approached it. What Orpheus walked through was not a gap in the guardian's defenses, not a trick, not a moment of inattention. It was the gate simply not being defended, because the thing that defended it had encountered something it had no method for resisting, and had responded, the only way a creature that is not capable of calculation can respond, by becoming still and remaining still, while the music continued past it into the deeper dark. Beyond the gate, the underworld opened into its full extent. The geography of the dead is enormous in the Greek tradition, not cramped or narrow, but wide and various, containing within it the full range of what the souls of the dead deserved and required. The asphodel meadows, where the majority of souls wandered without great pain or great pleasure, their identities gradually becoming faint, their memories of the living world growing thin. The Elysian fields, reserved for those whom the judges had found worthy of reward, a place of mild ease and pleasant light in the tradition's descriptions. And deeper, farther, past all of these, the region of Tartarus, where the punishment of specific souls had been proceeding since Zeus ordered it. Each punishment fitted precisely to the particular transgression of the person enduring it, designed to continue without end, because the crime it answered was considered to have no possible resolution except perpetual consequence. These punishments were not hidden. The tradition placed them where arriving souls could observe them, not necessarily as a warning, though that reading was available, but as a structural feature of the underworld's cosmology. The souls assigned to punish were there because they were there, because Minos and Rhadamanthus and Acus had judged them and the judgment was final, and they had been installed in Tartarus as permanently as the rivers had been installed in their courses. Tantalus stood in a pool of water beneath fruit-bearing branches, both the water and the fruit receding each time he reached for them. Sisyphus pushed his boulder up a hill that was the same hill in every direction, reaching the crest and watching the stone roll back, descending and beginning again. Ixion turned on his wheel of fire. The Danids, the 50 daughters of Danis, poured water without ceasing into vessels that had no bottom and could never be filled. These were the scenes that met Orpheus when he moved deeper into the underworld with his lyre still playing, and the tradition, specifically Ovid in the Metamorphoses, writing in the first decades of the 1st century CE, recorded what happened to each of those punishments when the music reached them. Tantalus stopped reaching. The water was still receding, the fruit was still pulling back from his outstretched hand, but his hand was no longer outstretched. He was simply standing in his pool, the water around his legs, the branches overhead, and he was listening, the perpetual motion of his thirst suspended for the first time since it had begun. Sisyphus sat down on his boulder. The image Ovid preserved is specific and oddly peaceful, a stone resting against the hillside, neither moving toward the crest nor rolling back, the man who had been condemned to push it, sitting with his hands on his knees, his face turned toward the source of the music coming from somewhere below him in the dark. The boulder had not gone anywhere. The hill was the same hill it had always been. The labor had not been canceled or commuted. It was simply paused, the way everything in the underworld was pausing, because the music had reached even here, and the muscles that had been working without rest since the judgment was passed had, for the length of a song, simply stopped. Ixion's wheel came to rest. The Danids set down their vessels. The tradition does not describe whether any of these figures looked at each other during this interval, whether they registered the stillness around them with anything like recognition, whether they understood what was producing the sound, or simply responded to it the way Cerberus had responded, by becoming quiet, by stopping, by allowing the extraordinary music to occupy the space that the punishment had filled. What the tradition records is only the fact of the pause, and the fact of the pause is itself the extraordinary thing. These were punishments designed by gods for reasons the gods considered sufficient. They had been running since before anyone living could remember. The music stopped them. This was the context in which Orpheus arrived before the thrones of Hades and Persephone. The hall where they sat was deep in the underworld, well past the gate, past the rivers, past the asphodel meadows, and the region where the judges conducted their assessments of arriving souls. It was not described in any tradition as small or spare. The king and queen of the dead governed an enormous population, and what they presided over was proportionally large. The dead who had come to hear the music had gathered around the throne room in numbers the tradition did not attempt to count, pressed close together in their gray quiet, and the sound of Orpheus's lyre moved through all of them and arrived at the two figures seated at the room's center. Hades is a figure the Greek tradition treated with a specific kind of gravity. He was not evil in the tradition's own understanding, not malevolent, not a figure who had chosen the position he occupied out of ambition or cruelty. He had received the realm of the dead by lot when the three brothers divided the cosmos between them, Zeus taking the sky, Poseidon the sea, and Hades the underworld, and he had administered it since then with the consistency of someone who understood that the dead required governance, that the borders between the living and the dead required maintenance, that the rules his realm operated by existed for reasons that served the order of the world. He enforced those rules. He did not deviate from them. He had once taken something from the living world that was not technically his to take. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, seized in a meadow and brought below to be his queen, but the tradition treated even that act as a matter eventually settled within the cosmological structure, winter and spring entering the world as its resolution. What Orpheus offered to this figure was not force and not bargaining in the ordinary sense. What the tradition describes, and Ovid rendered it in the direct speech that was his habit, the words reconstructed and given their full shape, is closer to an argument built from acknowledged truth. Orpheus did not claim Eurydice was wrongly taken. He acknowledged that she belonged to the underworld, that every living creature would eventually arrive here, that the death of his wife had not violated any rule that he wished to contest. What he asked for was a loan, a borrowing. Eurydice had arrived earlier than her time, or so the argument went, taken by a serpent's bite before her marriage had really begun, before the shape of the life she might have lived had fully become itself. He was asking, Orpheus said, for the time she had not been given, not for her permanent return, not for her exemption from the law that brought every soul eventually to this place, only for the years that the serpent in the tall grass had stolen from them both. When those years were spent, she would come back. Everything that had come here came back eventually. This was only a matter of order and of time. The tradition records that he also made another appeal. He invoked the story that stood behind the two figures on the thrones, the story of how Hades had looked up through the surface of the earth and seen a girl in a meadow, and been, in whatever way a god of the dead can be, taken by something he could not govern in himself, moved past the point of calculation, past the point where the rules he maintained had authority over what he wanted. The tradition does not describe the expression on Hades's face when this argument arrived. What it records is only the result. Persephone wept first. The detail is in Ovid, precise and quiet. Persephone unable to resist what the music and the argument together were doing, her face turned toward Orpheus, her composure overcome, and Hades, who did not weep, who was not the kind of figure the tradition ever described, weeping, whose function was the maintenance of a boundary that emotion could not be allowed to compromise, Hades, who had heard every plea of every soul that had ever arrived in his realm, and had administered each one according to the judgment of the appropriate authority, sat in his throne and listened to the music of a living man's lyre, and the appeal of a living man's grief, and found that the rules he enforced did not quite cover what was being asked, and gave his consent. The music continued through all of this. It had not stopped while Orpheus made his case. The lyre was playing even as he spoke, or perhaps he played between his words, or perhaps the tradition understood the music and the speech as continuous with each other. The argument made not only in words, but in the sustained presence of the sound itself, which had been filling the underworld's air since the moment he had first touched the strings at the bank of the Styx. The dead around the throne room had not moved from where they stood. The punishments in Tartarus were still suspended. The Furies, the Erinyes, the ancient goddesses of vengeance who functioned as the underworld's instruments of punishment, who had existed since before the reign of the Olympians, and whose purpose was the relentless pursuit of those who violated the fundamental bonds of obligation. The Furies, in that hall, on that occasion, were described by Ovid as doing something they had never done in all the time they had existed. They wept. The tradition treats this fact as a measure of something, and what it measures is calibrated by knowing what the Furies were. They were not susceptible to pity. They were not capable of being moved in the way that ordinary beings were moved by ordinary grief. Their function required a kind of absolute consistency, a pursuit that did not cease because the pursued felt remorse or offered explanation, that continued because the violation had occurred, and the violation required answer. The Furies did not operate on sympathy. They operated on structural justice, the kind that exists independently of whether any individual's suffering is understood or felt. And yet, standing in the hall of the dead, while a living man played his lyre and spoke the shape of his grief into the still air, each of the Furies turned her face toward the music, and on each face, slowly, one tear moved. This is the detail that ancient readers of Ovid apparently found most striking among all the extraordinary events of Orpheus's descent, because it stands as the clearest possible measure of what his art achieved. Not the taming of Cerberus, a formidable guardian certainly, but an animal susceptible to the same qualities in sound that affected all animals. Not the stopping of Sisyphus's boulder, a punishment enforced by divine decree, but a mechanical one, interrupted rather than countermanded. Not even the weeping of Persephone, who had been a girl in a meadow once, who had been taken from the living world herself, who had reason for an empathy that her husband's position required him to suppress. The Furies were the detail that carried weight, because the Furies were the ones who were not supposed to feel anything at all. And there they stood, in their usual positions in the Hall of Judgment, with their faces turned toward a sound they had no preparation for, and something in them responded to what they heard in the only way a body responds, when it is moved past the point where it can remain still. The hall was full. Every dead soul who could have come had come. The punishments in Tartarus were suspended. The ferryman was still at his station, but the coin transaction had not resumed. The three-headed dog was lying at the gate, with his great heads resting on his paws, the serpents along his back quiet, and on his throne in the deep of the underworld, the god who had never previously altered the terms on which a soul had been received into his kingdom, sat with his decision made. Eurydice would be given back. The condition was simple. As Orpheus ascended through the passage that led back to the living world, Eurydice would follow directly behind him. He was not to turn and look back at her until both of them had emerged fully into the light of the upper world. The condition was the condition. It came without further explanation, without, in the tradition's account, any statement of why the condition was what it was, rather than something else, whether the looking itself would undo the permission, or whether the looking was simply the test by which the permission could be enforced. Whether Hades understood it as a rule with cosmological grounding, or as an arbitrary term selected from the space of possible terms that might govern such an unprecedented arrangement. The tradition does not explain this, and there would be no honest purpose in adding an explanation the ancient sources did not provide. The condition was given. Orpheus accepted it. Eurydice was brought to stand at the beginning of the ascending passage. The footsteps began, his first, hers behind. The sound of two people moving upward through a narrow passage in the dark has a particular quality. The leading figure cannot hear the following figure's footsteps with precision. The sound of their own feet, the echo off the walls ahead of them, the slight displacement of air as they move upward, all overlap with and partially obscure whatever sound is coming from behind. A person following knows exactly what they hear, their own feet and the feet ahead of them, growing marginally louder as they move into the same acoustic conditions. But the leading person must trust what they cannot fully hear. The passage was narrow. The walls would have been stone, or whatever stone becomes in a place where stone serves the underworld's purposes. The air would have been changing as they climbed, cooling first in the way that deep underground places are cool, then perhaps very gradually warming as the distance above ground became shorter, the quality of the dark shifting in increments too small to measure but possible, perhaps to feel. Orpheus walked and played. The tradition places the lyre in his hands even during the ascent, the music continuing through the passage, filling the rock around them with sound. This was not a calculated choice in any version the tradition preserved. It was simply what Orpheus did, because the lyre was what he was, and in the situation he was in, with the condition he had accepted, and the weight of what was following behind him, the music was the thing his hands did. The sound would have moved back down the passage as well as upward, the notes traveling in both directions from the point of his body, filling the space between himself and Eurydice, reaching her before his footsteps did. She was walking behind him. She was, in the terms the tradition used, a shade, a soul of the dead, granted temporary passage in the wrong direction. Her form present enough that she could move through the physical passage, but not present in the way that a living body is present, not solid in the way that Orpheus was solid. The tradition does not describe her expression or her thoughts during the ascent, and any attempt to supply them would be invention rather than narration. She was behind him. Her footsteps were making whatever sound the footsteps of a shade make in a stone passage. He was moving upward. She was following. This continued for however long the passage was. The tradition does not give a distance. It does not describe rest stops or intervals or any marking of progress along the route. What it preserves is the movement and the condition, and then the single moment at which the condition was violated, and the specific quality of that moment as Virgil rendered it, which is worth dwelling in carefully rather than moving through quickly. Virgil used the Latin word furor, not mistake, not weakness, not even an ordinary impulsive choice made from anxiety or doubt. Furor, madness, frenzy, the kind of irrational force that operates outside of intention, that takes hold of a person and acts through them rather than being acted by them. The figure Virgil described turning in that passage did not choose to turn in the way that a person makes an ordinary choice, weighing considerations and arriving at a decision. Something turned him, some force that had been building through the entire ascent. The silence of the following footsteps, the impossibility of knowing with certainty that she was there, the weight of the condition itself pressing against him with every step, reached a point that Virgil called madness, and Orpheus turned to look. He was very close to the surface. The tradition, in both Virgil and Ovid, is consistent on this point. The backward glance did not happen early in the ascent, when the underworld was still close and the distance to the upper world was long. It happened when they were nearly through. A thin line of gray-white light would have been visible above, not sunlight exactly, not the full brightness of the world above, but the quality of light that begins to exist when the underground dark is only a short distance from open air. His next few steps would have brought him into that light. Her next few steps behind him would have brought her out as well. They were, by any reasonable measure, almost there. He turned. The moment of the turn and the moment of Eurydice's second loss are, in the tradition, the same moment, not sequential, but simultaneous, the turning itself completing the loss before any other factor could intervene. Ovid gives her words, brief and precise. She did not reproach him. This is a detail the tradition holds carefully, and it deserves to be held carefully, because reproach would have been available to her. The condition had been simple. He had been told it. They had been almost at the surface, and the choice that undid them had been his. She named the madness that had destroyed them, the same word, or its Greek equivalent, acknowledging what Virgil would later call furor, and she spoke no blame into it. She said farewell. The tradition gives the farewell as a word, or a short phrase, or in some accounts only the shape of words moving on her lips before the distance between them became too great for any sound to carry. She was drawn back, the tradition says, like a tide receding from a shore, not violently, not in agony, but in the specific helpless way that things move, when they are moving according to a force that is not their own and that does not require their consent. Orpheus reached out. His hands closed on the air where she had been. What a hand feels when it closes on air in that particular circumstance, when it was reaching for something that had been there and is no longer there. The tradition does not describe and does not need to describe. What the tradition records is the reaching and the air and the passage with only one set of footsteps remaining in it, and the thin line of gray-white light above that Orpheus now climbed toward alone, because there was nothing else to do. She was a shade again. The underworld had received her back with the same efficiency it received every soul that arrived in it. The permission had dissolved at the moment the condition was violated. The unprecedented arrangement was over. He emerged into the light of the upper world alone. The tradition does not record what the light looked like to him in that moment, whether the sky was particular, whether there was wind or warmth, or any quality of the living world that struck him as significant in the way that the first moment of returned sensation strikes someone who has been a long time in the dark. What the tradition moves directly toward is the grief, and the form the grief took, which was the same form it had always taken when Orpheus encountered something larger than what words alone could carry. He played. He wandered the landscape of Thrace with his lyre, and the music that came from it during those years of mourning was the music of everything the lyre had always been capable of, only now freighted with the specific weight of what had just happened, and the natural world responded to it in the same way it had always responded to his playing, the trees uprooting themselves to follow him, the animals gathering at his feet, the stones on the hillsides shifting slightly in the direction of the sound. The world followed the music. The music could not bring back what he had lost. These two facts coexisted in the Thracian landscape for years without resolution, because there was no resolution available. And still, in the hall deep in the underworld, the image Ovid preserved continues to hold its shape in the tradition. The Furies standing in their positions, each with a single tear on her face, the punishment suspended, the asphodel meadows quiet, the dead gathered around the throne room where Hades sat with his decision already given, the music still filling the air from a lyre held by a living man who had crossed the Styx and tamed the guardian of the gate and made his case before the king and queen of the dead and received the answer he had come for. For a moment, Orpheus had succeeded. The music had done what the tradition always said it could do, not merely moved an audience in the ordinary way that music moves people, pleasurably, temporarily, leaving them unchanged when it ended, but reached through the structure of the world itself and altered what was happening inside it. The punishments had stopped, the furies had wept, the boundary between the living and the dead had been crossed, and a soul had been authorized to cross it back. The lyre Orpheus played at the edge of the Styx had done something that no force or trick or bargain had accomplished, because it had not approached the underworld as an adversary to be defeated. It had simply played, and the underworld, being made of everything the living world had ever sent into it, had listened. Hades sat in the still of his throne room, the last note of Orpheus's music still faintly present in the air of his vast domain, the condition given, the consent extended, the unprecedented arrangement set in motion. Around him, the dead who had gathered stood in their quiet patience, their punishments not yet resumed, their gray attention still turned toward the space where the living man had been. Persephone's face was turned slightly away, the tears not entirely gone from it. And from every corridor of the underworld, from the far edge of the asphodel meadows, from the stations of the Danaids with their vessels still resting on the ground beside them, from the hillside where Sisyphus's boulder was still, and the man who pushed it was still sitting on it with his hands on his knees, a silence held, not the silence of before, not the silence of an underworld that had never heard a lyre, a silence that knew it had heard one and had been changed in ways the tradition understood as real, by what the music had asked of it, and what for one extraordinary moment it had given. The rock is cold here. That is the first thing, the specific coldness of limestone deep underground, a cold that has nothing to do with weather, that comes instead from the simple absence of sun across an enormous depth of stone. The walls of the passage are close on either side, close enough that a hand extended in either direction would find the surface immediately, and the rock is damp in the way that underground rock is always damp, with a thin moisture that comes from the stone itself and has been there since before anyone walked these particular corridors. The air moves very slightly. It moves upward, drawn toward whatever opening exists somewhere above, and in the moving it carries the first hint of something different from the cold, still atmosphere of the lower chambers, something barely warmer, barely more familiar, the suggestion of a world where air has been in contact with living ground rather than stone alone. Two sets of footsteps move through this passage. Both move upward. They are not identical. One set is heavier, more deliberate, landing with the particular weight of someone who has walked a very long way and is carrying the whole of his attention in a single direction, forward and up, only forward and up. The other set is softer, landing with less pressure, as though the feet making them rest only lightly on the stone, the way a person steps who has not yet decided fully that the ground they are walking on belongs to them. Both sets of footsteps echo. In a passage this narrow, every sound returns from the walls immediately, and the footsteps are doubled by their own reflections, so that the two figures ascending seem for a moment like four, or like a small company making its careful way toward the surface. The passage bends. Around the bend, the quality of the dark changes. It is still complete dark, no torch, no lamp, nothing that burns, but dark has gradations that become apparent only when the eyes have had long enough to adjust to it, and this dark is different from the dark below. Below, in the wide halls and the pale meadows and the river crossings, the dark was absolute and had the specific quality of permanence, the dark of a place where light had never been and was not expected. Here, the dark has something in it. It is the dark of a place that light is approaching, a darkness that is already in the process of being undone by something still far above but real, moving down through the stone in the particular slow way that light moves through great depths of rock and soil, not visible yet, not present as anything the eyes could report, but present as a quality, a thinning, a sense that the walls of the passage are not simply the walls of the passage, but the last walls, the final barrier before the world that exists above them. The footsteps continue. The air continues to move upward and to warm, fraction by fraction. The two figures have not spoken. There is an arrangement between them, an agreement made in the deep hall before a throne, in the presence of something that does not often grant what it granted today. And the arrangement has a single condition, a single term that governs this entire ascent. And the ascent continues. The rock passes on either side. The slight warmth continues to increase, so slowly that it would not be possible to name the moment it began, only to notice that the air now is different from the air 100 steps ago, and different still from the air 300 steps ago, and different in the lowest chambers where the cold was a permanent fact, and the warm world above was a rumor too far away to believe in. Something becomes visible. It is not light exactly, not yet, but it is the memory of light, or the promise of it, a faint gray quality appearing at the very edges of the passage above, where the stone curves and the corridor makes its final approach to the surface. The gray is subtle enough that it might be imagined. It is not imagined. It is there, and it is the first thing that has been visible in this passage since the descent began, the first evidence that the upper world has not ceased to exist while these two figures have been below it. Virgil, writing in the 1st century BCE, describes this moment with a precision that his language holds steady even across 2,000 years of distance. In his telling, Orpheus and Eurydice were close, very close, to the point where the dark passage opened into light. The word Virgil used for what overcame Orpheus in that moment was furor. It is a Latin word that does not carry a single clean English translation. It means madness, but not the madness of illness or confusion. It means a frenzy, for force from outside the self that enters the mind and takes the controls away from reason, the way a gust of wind enters a room through an open door and moves every paper on the table before reason can close the door again. Furor, not a choice, not a failure of love or nerve, something that moved through him from the direction of the surface, from the direction of the gray light above, and turned his head before he understood that his head was turning. He looked back. The passage holds what that means for a moment before continuing. He was nearly at the surface. The gray light was there, above him. Eurydice was behind him, her soft footsteps still audible on the stone. He had crossed the Styx with his lyre and returned. He had stood before the thrones in the deep hall and spoken his case and been heard. He had walked out again, through gates that Cerberus guards, and through the halls where the Furies stand, and through the pale wide meadows, and across the water and upward through this long passage in the rock. He had done everything. He had come to within the distance of a few steps from the light, and then the furor entered him, and he turned. In Ovid's account, written a generation after Virgil's in a different key, warmer, more specific about the human interior, Eurydice spoke at the moment she was drawn back. Her words, as Ovid renders them, named what had happened without accusation. She did not reproach him. She did not name what he had lost, or what she had lost, or what the turning had cost both of them. She named only the madness, the furor, the same word across both languages, and she said farewell, and the word farewell came out of her and reached him, and then she was receding, drawn back the way a tide recedes from a shore, steady and complete, and not subject to argument. He reached for her, his hands extended into the space where she had been, and closed on nothing, because she was already a shade again, already dissolved back into the substance of the place she had been walking out of. And his hands found only the air of the passage and the faint warmth of the world that was now only his again. The gray light remained above him. He was still close to the surface. Nothing had changed in the passage itself. The walls were the same walls, the air was the same air, the stone was the same stone, and the footsteps that continued upward from that point were only one set. He walked out. He came into the light, and the light was the same light it would have been if both of them had walked into it together. Unremarkable, the ordinary light of the upper world, completely indifferent to what had just occurred a few steps below it in the dark. The tradition does not dwell long on what the immediate surface looked like. The sources move past it because the important thing that happened below the surface, and the surface is simply where the story of the descent ends and the story of the aftermath begins. What the tradition does describe, in both Virgil and Ovid, and in fragments of older sources that both poets drew from, is the long years that followed. Orpheus withdrew. That is the word that the tradition reaches for. He withdrew from human society, from the company of other people, from whatever ordinary life might have looked like in the Thracian hills, where he had always lived. He went into the wild parts of the landscape, the high and forested places, the river banks where no one lived, and he played his lyre, and he mourned. The mourning had no visible end. The grief did not diminish into something manageable across the years that the tradition describes. It persisted at the same pitch, or at something very close to it, and the music he played in those years carried the grief fully, note by note, into the air around him. The natural world responded as it had always responded to his playing. The trees came toward the sound. Ovid, describing these years in the 11th book of the Metamorphoses, gives a list of them: the oak, the poplar, the lime tree, the beech, the laurel, others, all drawing their roots slowly through the soil toward where Orpheus sat, or walked, arranging themselves in a closer ring than nature would arrange them, a forest gathered by music rather than by time or weather. Animals came and lay down near him, birds settled, stones shifted. The world continued to do what it had always done in the presence of his art, assembling itself attentively around the sound, and none of it could touch the specific thing the grief was about, or address the specific loss that the music carried. There is something in that image that the ancient sources seem to understand without needing to name it. The whole natural world came to him. The whole created, physical world assembled itself as close as it could get, stone and tree and creature, and listened with everything it had, and it was entirely useless as a comfort. The music could move the world, and it could not move the grief, because the grief was not about the world. It was about a particular absence inside the world, and the world in its entirety, present and attentive, could not fill or address or replace the one thing that was not there. He did not return to ordinary life. He did not. In the years Ovid describes, seek another companion or rebuild whatever existed before. He remained in the wild places, playing, and the world arranged itself around him and listened and could do nothing more than that. The tradition that tells what happened next belongs primarily to Ovid, though the broad outline of it appears across multiple ancient sources, and some version of it seems to have been present in the story from an early period. The Maenads of Thrace found him. The Maenads were the female devotees of Dionysus, Bacchus in the Roman tradition. Ovid was writing within, associated with the god's wildest and most ecstatic religious rites. Their worship involved states of frenzy, of deliberate possession by the divine, in which ordinary restraint and ordinary rules did not apply, and in which acts became possible that would otherwise be impossible. The tradition had always placed them in Thrace, the same wild region where Orpheus lived and wandered. Ovid's account of what happened is specific and does not soften it. The Maenads attacked him. The reasons the tradition offers for their attack vary across sources. Some suggest Orpheus had, in his grief, turned away from the worship of Dionysus in favor of Apollo. Others suggest a simpler fury, the kind that belongs to the frenzy itself and needs no further explanation. Whatever the cause, the result is consistent across accounts. They killed him. The manner of his death was the tearing apart of his body, the specific fate that the tradition associated with the intensity of Bacchus possession. They were in the state the tradition calls enthusiasm, the god inside them, and in that state they tore him apart and cast what remained into the Hebrus River. The Hebrus is a real river. It runs through Thrace, through what is now the borderland between Greece and Bulgaria, and into the northern Aegean. And in the 1st century CE, it was a river the educated Roman audience Ovid was writing for would have been able to locate on a map, a real geographical feature in a real landscape that was still understood as wild and spiritually potent. The tradition gave this real river the specific task of carrying Orpheus downstream. His head went into the water, his lyre went into the water, and both continued to produce sound. The head sang, floating face upward on the current, moving with the water's pace through the landscape of Thrace, past whatever was growing on the banks, past whatever birds were in the trees above the river. The lyre sounded alongside it, struck by whatever current moved against its strings, producing music without hands. Both moved together down the length of the river and eventually reached the sea, and the sea carried them further, and eventually they came to shore on the island of Lesbos. Lesbos is also a real island. It sits in the northeastern Aegean, close to the coast of what is now Turkey, and in the ancient world it was associated above all with lyric poetry. It was the island of Sappho, of the great lyric tradition that flourished there in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, and the ancient Greeks understood that association between Lesbos and lyric song as something that needed an explanation, something that had a cause. The story of Orpheus's head washing ashore on Lesbos carrying music was in one sense that explanation. The island that became the home of the greatest lyric poetry the tradition produced was the island where the founder of song, where the first and greatest musician, had come to rest. The tradition holds that after the head and the lyre arrived on Lesbos, the singing continued for some time. Various ancient sources mention that a shrine to Orpheus was established there, that the oracle that operated from his resting place was consulted on questions the living needed answered. His voice continued to be useful, even in this final, most extreme form of loss, dispersed, scattered, sent down a river. Something in Orpheus kept producing what he had always produced, kept offering what his art had always offered, and the island received it and made something permanent from it. The Muses, who were Orpheus's mother's sisters, Calliope, his mother, was one of the 9, and the others were all aware of what had happened, gathered the rest of him from where it had come to rest. What the tradition says about the burial varies across sources, but the location most consistently named is Libethra in the Pyrenean region, the same mountain territory on the border of Thrace and Macedonia that the ancient world associated with the home of the Muses, the same ridgeline that overlooked the place where the tradition believed the Muses dwelled and where the songs they inspired had always originated. He came home to the mountains, finally, not in the way he had hoped to return, not with Eurydice and the long life the marriage had seemed to promise, but back to the place the Muses had always occupied, the high ground above the world where the origin of song was located. The Muses buried him. The tradition says they mourned him, which is a remarkable detail. The 9 Muses, the goddesses who presided over every form of art and creative expression the ancient world recognized, in mourning for the death of the man who had embodied what they gave more completely than any other human being before or after him. And then the thing happened that the tradition preserved most carefully from this final part of the story, the thing that Pausanias records in his description of Greece, the thing that the ancient world found meaningful enough to pass down through multiple sources across many centuries, which is that the nightingales nesting near Orpheus's grave at Lebethra sang more sweetly than nightingales anywhere else in the world. It is a small detail. It is the kind of detail that could be overlooked in favor of the larger, more dramatic elements of the story: the descent, the plea, the backward glance, the head singing on the river. But the ancient sources kept it. Pausanias noted it as a known fact, a piece of observed natural history attached to a specific location, as though it were the kind of thing a traveler to the Pierian region could still verify by visiting the site and listening to the birds in the trees above it. The nightingales at Lebethra sang better than nightingales elsewhere. The explanation the tradition provided was that they were nesting near the remains of Orpheus, and his music, even in the form of scattered bone and buried memory, was still affecting the birds above him, still shaping the quality of what they produced, still being useful to song in whatever attenuated form it had come to exist in after his death. The persistence of that image is worth holding for a moment before the story moves to its final element. Not the dramatic persistence, the singing head on the river, the lyre still sounding on the current, but this quieter, more ordinary persistence. Birds in trees above a grave, singing better than birds elsewhere because of who was buried below them. The art did not end, it became ambient. It diffused into the landscape around the place where Orpheus came to rest, and continued to exert its influence on the living creatures moving through that landscape, producing music above the place where the musician lay. The ancient world found this believable. More than believable, it found it appropriate, the right kind of thing for the tradition to report, consistent with everything it understood about what Orpheus had been and what music was. His lyre did not stay on Lesbos. The tradition that describes what became of it attributes its final placement to Zeus, acting at the request of the Muses. Zeus, in the account the ancient world preserved, took the lyre and placed it among the stars. The constellation that bears the name Lyra has been in the sky for as long as the sky has been mapped and named. The ancient Greeks identified the pattern of stars that forms it, and gave it the name they gave it for a reason, not arbitrarily, not because the stars happened to suggest the shape of a lyre to some early astronomer who had no particular reason to think of one, but because the tradition held that the specific lyre placed there had a specific history, belonged to a specific figure, and had done specific things that made its preservation among the permanent features of the sky make sense. The brightest star in the constellation is Vega. It sits at the upper corner of the pattern, the part that the ancient Greeks understood as the top of the instrument, the place where the strings were fastened, and it is among the brightest stars in the entire northern sky, burning with a particular blue-white brightness that makes it visible even on nights when the sky is not completely clear, even from places where the light of cities has softened the darkness enough to hide lesser stars. Vega burns through that. It is easy to find. On a summer night in the northern hemisphere, if the sky is clear, it is often the first star to appear as the sky darkens, presenting itself before the others are ready, holding its position at the top of the constellation and staying there. Below and to the right of Vega, 4 fainter stars form a small parallelogram, a roughly quadrilateral shape that the Greeks understood as the body of the lyre itself, the resonating box from which the strings ran upward to where Vega anchors the frame. The 4 stars are fainter than Vega, but still visible to the naked eye on a clear night, and they hold their positions relative to Vega and to each other with the absolute steadiness that all stars appear to hold for the span of a human life and several human lifetimes beyond that, moving with the slow procession of the celestial sphere, but appearing fixed for any observer making a single night's observation, appearing to be simply there, in the same arrangement they were in last night and the night before, and every clear night reaching back as far in either direction as the tradition can follow them. The parallelogram of the body, the bright star at the top, the strings implied between them, invisible but understood to be there by anyone who knows what the instrument looks like and has been told what the pattern represents. Lyra, in the sky. The lyre of Orpheus, placed there by Zeus at the muse's request, preserved in light at an altitude from which no river and no maenads and no grief and no furor can reach it. There is something the tradition was doing with that placement, something it clearly meant. The lyre had been through everything. It had played at the edge of the Styx and stilled a ferryman who had never been stilled before. It had caused 3-headed Cerberus to lie down with all his heads resting on his front paws and his eyes half closed. It had played in the deepest hall of the underworld and stopped the wheel of Ixion and stilled the boulder of Sisyphus and caused the Furies to weep for the first and only time in the history of their existence. It had played in the wild hills of Thrace for years, while the trees uprooted themselves to come closer. It had sounded on the surface of the Hebrus River, drifting alongside a severed head that was still singing, until both came to shore on Lesbos. And after all of that, after every possible thing that an object could be taken through, it was placed in the sky, where it is unchangeable, where it has stayed in the same position relative to the stars around it, since the night it was placed there, and will stay in that same position for every clear night that follows. The tradition seems to have understood that what Orpheus's lyre represented, what music itself represented, in the specific form this particular story had given it, was worth preserving permanently. Not because the tradition was sentimental about beautiful things, though it was capable of sentiment, but because the story of Orpheus had made an argument across all its episodes and variations and ancient sources about what music could do. It could move the physical world. It could stop the machinery of divine punishment. It could make the administrators of death relent. It could not hold what it most needed to hold. It could not keep Eurydice from being drawn back, could not prevent the furor that turned Orpheus's head at the last step, could not address the grief that followed across the years of his wandering. Music, in this story, was capable of everything except the one thing that mattered most to the person making it. And yet the lyre is in the sky. The tradition placed it there without contradiction, without resolving the tension between what the music achieved and what it failed to achieve, and let both things remain true simultaneously. The music was the most powerful force in the story, and the music was not enough, and the lyre is in the sky nonetheless, preserved exactly as it was when it was playing. On a clear dark night, the kind of clear dark night that has become rarer as the world has gathered more of its light together in its cities, but that still exists in the places far enough from those cities that the sky can open fully above a person standing in it. Lyra is visible from late spring through early autumn in the northern hemisphere, climbing the eastern sky after sunset and passing through the zenith over the course of the night before descending in the west. Vega is almost always the easiest way to find it. The brightness of that one star draws the eye and holds it, and once the eye is there, the four fainter stars of the body become apparent, holding their parallelogram below and to the sides, and the whole instrument appears, small and complete and unchanged. The Greeks who first named that pattern and told the story attached to it were looking at the same stars. Not metaphorically the same stars, actually the same arrangement of the same suns at the same distances, visible from the same planet, producing the same light. The story that explains why those stars form the shape they form and hold the name they hold is at least 2,500 years old in its written forms, and older than that in whatever oral tradition preceded the writing.